we start our third section, sleep disorders. A lot of this coming out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, edition 5, 5th edition, came out in 2013, a long time ago now. So the first part of this, we're going to look at the disorders that are in here. I'm not just going to read the slides to you. Most of the information you need is on the slides. We'll talk about the conditions and what differentiates some of them. But first, before we get in here, let's talk about what counts as a disorder. And this isn't just true of the sleep disorders. This is true all through this book. The DSM-5 gets torn apart a lot for pathologizing everyone. And where that comes from is people can flip through and look at the use or look at the diagnostic criteria, look at the symptoms, and say, oh, I know people who have these, or I had this at one point, so I have this disorder. There is a key piece of criteria in pretty much everything in here that most critics miss. And it isn't that having had those traits gives you a disorder. The traits have to meet one of two criteria. They have to cause you subjective distress, meaning they're bothering you in some way, and or cause problems in functioning in some important area. If the traits are causing that, now you're in the realm of disorder. If they're not, then they're just traits you have and there's nothing abnormal about them. That's why so many people will self-label with disorder labels simply because they can identify some traits they have that are traits of a disorder, but the traits aren't causing them distress or getting in the way of functioning. And we'll see in a lot of these, they also have to be frequent enough and have occurred for a long enough period of time. Otherwise, they could just be transitional traits or shifts in the environment or short-term things. Disorders, to hit this qualifier, have to be rather pervasive and occur more frequently than not for an extended period of time. So that's something we need to look at as we go through here. Another thing, if you are seeking treatment for a sleep disorder, first thing we would want to do is a good physical exam, because a lot of medical conditions can cause sleep disorder. In fact, on the second bullet on this slide where it says comorbidity is the rule, not the exception, there's always something else going on with a sleep disorder that could be causing the sleep disorder, or the sleep disorder is causing it. So we always have to figure out what else is going on here that's fueling it. So we got kind of four basic categories here of things, medical issues that can cause sleep problems. Breathing disorders, probably heard of sleep apnea, we're going to hit that. Disorders of the heart and lungs, anything that's going to interfere with oxygen production or flow can interfere with sleep as well. Neurodegenerative disorders, so we get into the dementias and Alzheimer's, that can cause problems. And anything in the musculoskeletal system. Key one here would be arthritis. Anything that can cause pain or discomfort can interrupt your normal sleep pattern and cause a sleep disorder. So, third bullet down here where it says can be a prodromal expression of a mental condition. What does prodromal mean? Prodromal is the phase, because most mental health conditions come in waves. You'll kind of build up, you'll hit a peak, it'll go away. Later it will come back. Again, that's why one of the things this book requires is that things are recurrent. They keep coming back, or they stay for a long period of time. Prodromal is that early stage when something is building. And the reason we have depression on here is because there is some research, and again, we don't necessarily know the causal direction of this, that shows if you are prone to depression, as a depressive cycle is starting to build, and you may not be consciously aware of it yet, you may not notice the feelings changing as this cycle is building again, sleep dysfunction can be one of the early signs of that. Now, does that mean the oncoming depression is causing that sleep dysfunction, or does the sleep problem itself bring that on? That's something that's still up to debate. So regardless, all sleep disorders, as the last bullet notes here, can cause physical and mental health conditions. And of all the sleep disorders, all of them, obviously, if you're not getting sufficient restful sleep, you're going to experience fatigue, sleepiness during the day. Mood disturbances can be depression, anxiety, just irritability. And here's where, when we say creating a cycle, if you've had a problem sleeping, that can make you anxious about getting enough sleep. And anxiety is a key thing that can keep you from falling asleep. So it kind of starts to steamroll, kind of snowball its own thing in there. So let's look at the DSM-5 categories. Here's just a long list of where we're going to go here. So near the bottom, restless legs syndrome was actually a fairly new one. It wasn't in the DSM-4 for a while. We weren't even sure it was a real thing, but enough research supported it as an actual and valid syndrome that it made it into the book. So we're going to hit these categories as we go through. So nightmare disorder, we are going to hit that as a disorder, but a lot of the detail on that one we're going to save for our section on nightmares. Now the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's where we're going to be grabbing these categories from. The international classification, literally called International Classification of Sleep Disorders. Third edition came out about a year after the DSM-5 did. They break it down into these categories. A lot of them, you see there are a few categories, but everything we're going to talk about has a corresponding label within there. What's the difference between the two? The DSM's categories are pretty much based on clinical identification and treatment. Here's what they are. Here are the symptoms we see with them. But it's not really designed for people who are sleep specialists or people who delve into the scientific study of sleep. The ICSD-3 is more technically oriented. It's more for sleep specialists who study that area. So it'll get a little more detailed in there. That's a difference a lot of people don't think about, that we run into a lot when it comes to supposed experts talking online about things. You can go to medical school, be a doctor, trained to be a general practitioner, right? So you know from your training what the symptoms are of certain illnesses, what medications are usually used to treat those, what the side effects and interactions can be of those medications. But just because you've had that training doesn't mean you understand how the medication is having its effect or what the active mechanism of it is. That's an entirely different area, a more specialized area of study. Then you're going into biochemistry in that area, and a lot of doctors are not trained in that area. Why? Because you don't need to be. If you're a general practitioner or a specialist in a particular area, you just need to know that something works. You don't necessarily need to know what, at a chemical level, the active mechanisms are there. That's why you get a lot of doctors who get their opinions of things, but they don't even know how the drug they are either supporting or criticizing works. So let's hit the first one here because it is the most common. And we're going to put these in order that they are within the DSM-5. So insomnia is the first one. A lot of people think insomnia just means not being able to fall asleep, and that is the most common complaint. But it also means having trouble staying asleep and sometimes waking up too early and not being able to get back to sleep. So it can be any of those. I either can't get to sleep at all, or once I do get to sleep, I keep waking up and have trouble getting to sleep. Or let's say my alarm's supposed to go off at 5 in the morning, and I wake up at 3:30 or 4, and I can never get back to sleep until it's time to wake up. So some sort of disturbance in sleep there, problem staying asleep or getting asleep, that results in you not getting enough sleep or not getting restful sleep. And here's where we see requirement. Now, this is in almost all of them here. These next two bullets, that this occurs at least 3 nights a week, has been going on for at least 3 months. There's the time frame we have to have in there before we would say this is in the realm of disorder, because there are a lot of other just cyclical or environmental influences or personal issues that could cause this to kind of happen briefly for a period of time and then go away. We don't put it in the realm of disorder unless it's gone on long enough. I don't put these 2 criteria on the slides for all the things we're going to talk about, but pretty much on all of them, this frequency and time frame are required in there. Okay, now another one here, I said I wasn't going to read all of them, but let's note it, that these things occur even though you do have opportunity for sufficient length of sleep. It doesn't happen when you're rushed or when you're worried about having to get up early, things like that. And these other ones, we're going to see, I don't put these on all these slides either, but these are in on all of these, that it's not better explained by another condition. Everything in the DSM kind of gives you a little warning. If you're going to diagnose this, here's a bunch of other things it could be. Make sure it's not those before you diagnose this one. Not attributable to the effects of a substance. We're going to see substance and medicine. Sleep disorders are a separate category. And if there is a coexisting mental or medical condition, it does not explain this condition of insomnia. So it basically needs to be identifiable on its own. So when it comes to personality factors or psychological conditions that could have it, you have here anxiety is obviously a big one. Anxiety creates more active neurological response that can stop the areas of the brain that need to go to sleep from going to sleep. Go back to the physiology side and the things that start to trigger it, start to slow areas of the brain down. If you are internally tense or anxious, that energy can actually fight off the signals that are trying to get you to go to sleep. If you tend to be someone who just worries about things and ruminates about things too much, that can put you at higher risk. And when it says here, emotion-focused, internalizing style of conflict resolution, that means when it comes to conflict, you don't work on how to solve it. You worked on just dealing with the emotions associated with it, and that gets you worked up. Somatic focus just means paying too much attention to body sensation. So when it comes to physical characteristics here, thingy in there, again, we find when we look at the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, there we're talking about kind of chronic stress, even if it's low levels of stress. Cortisol, usually thought of as the stress hormone. Cortisol is released in response to stress. In the fight-flight response, you get a big hit of cortisol. Cortisol usually spikes early in the morning around the time you wake up, and that seems to be meant as a way to help you wake up and become alert, and then your levels of cortisol will gradually decline through the day. In the case of chronic stress, your base levels of cortisol will be higher. If you're taking a medication that's a glucocorticoid, that can also increase anxiety and the sensation of stress and give you a problem. And then all these others, we already hit reactivity to stress. Any imbalance in the body that causes variability that kind of takes you out of your baseline can cause sleep distress. Okay, so most common sleep disorder, about a third of adults at some point will experience it. I say slightly higher prevalence in women. It's not a huge difference. And we always have a problem with the disorders in this book when it says they are more likely to be diagnosed in women. The problem with that is women are more likely to seek treatment and therefore possibly be overrepresented in the clinical sampling. So it's hard to know how many men suffer from it and never seek treatment or never report it. So the fact that there's just a slight prevalence in women tells us it may actually be fairly gender balanced. There's really nothing biologically that would suggest why women would have this more than men, although around the several months after having a child is when you're more likely to see this spike, and there is all sorts of biochemical and environmental things there that are fueling that at that time. 50% of cases attributed to a mental health condition, and here we get into depression and anxiety. Both of them, simply by the way they work, will interrupt sleep. In fact, depression, you can have cases of either you're not sleeping enough, can't stay asleep in the case of insomnia, or you can have what is called hypersomnolence, where you are sleeping too much. In fact, depression, it turns out you spend a lot of time in REM sleep. And REM is that area of sleep where you're most likely to have the most negative and anxiety-producing dreams. So you can see where that's going to fuel something like that. So this last bullet, when we say insomnia can be situational, persistent, or recurrent, that's probably pretty self-explanatory, but let me hit that. You can have certain specific situational factors in which you have insomnia. For example, let's say it's the night before you start a job, or the night before the first day of school, or the night before any big event the next day. You may have a history of always having trouble getting to sleep when the next day there is some either big important event or an anxiety-provoking event. Persistent would be we don't find environmental factors that are doing it. It just seems to always be there, and we can't find a specific trigger that sets it off. And recurrent is when we would see a period of time you have it, it goes away. Later we find it cycles back in. So any one of those could be part of that. So definitely an issue there. Which brings us to hypersomnolence disorder. And again, this is where you sleep too much. So these are kind of opposite ends of a spectrum, and you can actually have the same source hitting these. We just mentioned in depression, you can have either one of these in depression. So when it comes to looking at what is abnormal sleep for you, we have to look at what is your normal sleep pattern. And anything that may be a disorder for you is anything that goes outside of that pattern for an extended period of time. It can be too much sleep, it can be too little sleep. Maybe your normal sleep time, and you always hear 8 hours a day to sleep. Research has actually supported closer to 7 hours. But the reason we would still tell you to plan for 8 hours is you don't know how long it takes you to get to sleep. So always leave some leeway in there. And it's not part of our dream journal that we're doing, but that can be an interesting thing to keep track of. It's hard to know how long it took you to get to sleep because you basically enter a period essentially of amnesia as you drift toward it. So you may not know. The only times you really notice how long it takes to get to sleep is when it's taking longer than usual and you find yourself looking at the clock and noting the passage of time. I did a little self-study on that where I would take naps sometimes, had my noise canceller headphones on, and I would listen to a playlist of music that I put in there just to concentrate on as I went to sleep so my mind wouldn't be distracted by other things. We'll actually talk about that process a little bit later. And I would think later when I woke up from that nap, what is the last song I remember? Do I remember getting to the third song on the playlist? That kind of gave me a clue as to how long it took me to get to sleep. And I found that was fairly consistent after a period of time. I also found if I made the playlist long enough to basically correlate to a full sleep cycle of going all the way down to deep sleep and coming all the way back, then when the list ended, it would kind of wake me up, that sudden absence of the sound, and I could have a more refreshed awakening from it. So we'll look later at a bunch of different methods you may use to kind of restore sleep balance. So oversleep, and again, if we consider a normal sleep period to be at least 7 hours, this is our basis for what counts as too much sleep. So usually we're looking at episodes of more than 9 hours. That is so let's take a number here and let's say your normal sleep pattern is different than 7. So let's just say add another 2 hours to that, and then that would be oversleeping for you. But the key here is the word non-restorative. That means you wake up, but you do not feel rested. So if you crashed out for 12 hours and you wake up and you still feel groggy and sleepy, that is not good restorative sleep. And then obviously if you got a lot of sleep, but you still take naps during the day or lapse into sleep, that would fall into here, because we wouldn't expect that if you were getting good restorative sleep, and if you're having trouble waking up afterward. Now, a lot of people, especially if you wake up to an alarm clock, the alarm clock may wake you up in a deep stage of sleep, and you're going to have a little time pulling your head together. If you took a nap but you awoke during a deep stage, you're going to be groggy. So when we say difficulty being fully awake after an abrupt awakening, again, we find that this is something consistent. It's not that it happens to me sometimes. Here's our number again, at least 3 times a week for at least 3 months you've had this going on. And another one is you're not as alert or functional when you're awake. You're getting a lot of sleep, yet your functioning is the functioning we would expect from lack of sleep. So, and let's look at this last one, sleep inertia, or called sleep drunkenness. This is when essentially you're acting like you don't have full control. You're stumbling around. That's why they call it sleep drunkenness. You're having trouble coordinating body movements. You may walk weird, like you're stumbling. You have trouble reaching for things. And during this time when you woke up, you may have an obvious measurable change in mood or behavior. Very irritable, or a change from your normal expected behavior and attitude. So that is the hyper version, excessive in that case. Okay, this brings us into narcolepsy. You've probably heard of this one, and you probably have kind of some stereotypes about this. And this doesn't necessarily mean, think of narcolepsy as a continuum, as a spectrum from very severe to more mild. The severe cases are the ones where you will see people just uncontrollably fall asleep in the middle of the day. But as in the middle and lower end of that spectrum, it is simply an incredible urge, sudden onset urge to fall asleep. Like you're at a period of your day where you should be functional, but you're just suddenly like you're hitting a wall and you just have to lay down and close your eyes, even though you've been getting sufficient sleep. Now here is our 3 times a week over the past 3 months. And at least one of the following. The DSM does this as well in pretty much everything in it. You're going to see some primary symptoms, and then you're going to see a little laundry list that'll say, like, you need 3 of the following 7 or 4 of the following 9 things. And where that comes from is the study of this has found a cluster of common symptoms, but they do not necessarily all occur together all the time. So we're going to see if you're in the group there. So when we say cataplexy, that's basically paralysis. You just lose muscle tone and you just go down. A lot of times when you fall asleep, your head may just nod over, but if you go into cataplexy, you just lose it all. You may just roll right over onto the floor. This is common of REM sleep, and common of something that's found in a lot of cases of narcolepsy, where instead of going into stage 1 sleep and then down into 2 and 3 and then back up and going to REM, a lot of people with narcolepsy will fall directly into REM. And one of the things that happens in REM, as we've mentioned before, is the pons cuts off motor signals to the body. It essentially just takes muscle tone to 0, essentially paralyzes you. That is the key, if you've wondered so far, because we mentioned this a couple times, of sleep paralysis. When you can wake up and not be able to move briefly, that's because you've awoken suddenly from REM and the pons has not yet released its hold on motor function. So there'll be a period of time where you can't move. It's usually just seconds to a minute. It can fall into the realm of disorder if it goes longer than that, but that's just part of that functioning there. So we see this happen. Hypocretin deficiency, a video is going to mention that in a moment. When we say sleep latency here, it says REM sleep latency less than or equal to 15 minutes and 2 or more sleep onset REM periods. Sleep onset REM means you went directly into REM when you shouldn't have. REM sleep latency, we should see REM at the end of a cycle, but if it comes in too early, that's a problem. So sleep latency, we usually mean when you hear that, that means how long it takes you to fall asleep. So if I wire you up and lay you in a bed and say, okay, go to sleep, and you lay there and close your eyes, your sleep latency period is the time it takes to when I can see the measures that you are asleep. And usually on average, for most people, that's somewhere between, I mean, if you go to bed at a consistent time when you're tired, we tend to see 8 to 15 minutes in there. Doesn't mean you're abnormal if you go longer than that. Some people have a longer normal latency period. You should try to keep an eye on what that is. But in general, we see relatively quick sleep for most people if you go to bed when you're tired. So the cataplexy, the sudden paralysis, sleep onset, we find in people with narcolepsy, strong emotion can do it, and that can be positive or negative emotion. A lot of people, when they're laughing hard about something, they'll just knock out. Let's take a look at a couple cases here with narcolepsy.
And how to kind of try to describe it to them. I found over time it's really difficult for people to understand it.
It's just very complicated with this tiredness, the cataplexy, the fragmented sleep at night.
If you're a normal person, you've got sleep and you've got your waking life, and occasionally they'll overlap a little bit. For me, I live in this world that is very rarely am I fully awake and very rarely am I fully asleep. I live in the in-between.
I'm Tom Scanlon. I'm a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. Narcolepsy is a neurologic disorder. It is one of the most common sleep disorders. It affects about 1 in 2,000 people. Doesn't matter how much sleep they get at night, they're going to feel sleepy every day. People also can have a variety of other symptoms. These include hypnagogic hallucinations, where they can have very vivid dreamlike hallucinations just as they're drifting off to sleep or just when they awaken. They can have something called sleep paralysis, where as they're falling asleep or sometimes when they wake up, they can't move. And then there's cataplexy, which is similar to sleep paralysis. The distinction is that cataplexy occurs right in the middle of the day, and it's triggered by strong emotions. And then the last thing, which is perhaps sort of one of the strangest of all, is that, for considering that somebody with narcolepsy is often very sleepy through the day, they often have fragmented sleep at night. They can wake up 4 or 5 times for 10 or 20 minutes for no clear reason. And so in the same way that they have trouble maintaining wakefulness through the day, they can have trouble maintaining sleep through the night. Somewhere between age 10 and age 20 or so is when narcolepsy begins. People usually start off with sleepiness, and then the other symptoms follow. So there's a number of different systems in the brain that are involved in promoting arousal or wakefulness and sleep. Up here's the cortex. This is the front near the forehead. Here's the back. This is the brainstem coming down here. And this is the cerebellum, which is involved in balance. The brainstem is the site that most of these arousal-promoting signals come from. And those cells send connections up throughout the whole front part of the brain, and they help turn on the cortex and other parts of the brain when you're awake. There's also some cells in a small region called the hypothalamus that are involved in promoting sleep. And these sleep-promoting cells, one of the things they do is they actually turn off the wake-promoting cells. And so that allows you to be fully asleep without any hint of consciousness. This is called the mammillary body, and just above it, right here, is where the hypocretin neurons sit. And this is a really critical collection of neurons, brain cells, that makes very particular and special neurotransmitters known as hypocretin or orexin. Those are just 2 names for the same thing. The hypocretin-producing cells help activate and sustain activity in the other wake-promoting brain regions across the day. The brain contains billions of neurons, and only a very, very small number of these produce hypocretin. It's probably somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000, which sounds like a large number, but when you compare it to 10 billion neurons, it's really very small. In narcolepsy, those hypocretin-producing cells die off. When you look closely at the brain of somebody who has narcolepsy, what you see is about a 90 to 95% loss of the hypocretin-producing neurons. So there's two broad themes that are being pursued in narcolepsy research right now. One theme is to understand what goes wrong in the brain when the hypocretin-producing cells die off. How does that lead to sleepiness and cataplexy and other symptoms? Another big theme is trying to understand what actually kills the hypocretin neurons in the first place. Because if we could understand that, then it's possible that if one could diagnose and recognize narcolepsy right at the earliest stages, we might be able to get in and stop that process. As we've discovered more and more about what's actually causing the hypocretin neurons to die off, and as we've discovered more about the consequences of that for the brain, it's really given us a lot of hope for new opportunities for coming up with better therapies for people with narcolepsy. If we could get hypocretin back in the brain somehow, that would be potentially as great as giving insulin to people with diabetes. It would really be the missing factor coming back into play, and it could, in theory, cure their sleepiness and cure their cataplexy in the most thorough fashion. Right now, scientists are working with a variety of techniques to try to get hypocretin signaling back into the brain, but the hope is that in 5, 10, or 15 years, we may see those hypocretin replacement therapies coming into clinical practice.
Yeah, so you can imagine if that gets very severe, that can be dangerous in things like operating equipment, driving, if you don't have control over that. Again, when we look at neurotransmitters in the brain produced by certain areas, we see they are low. That's why narcolepsy can be treated medically to try to balance that out. So there is an answer to that. Now, if you don't get enough sleep in any given night, and you just have a tendency, you're getting home and you try to watch a movie and you keep falling asleep while you're doing it, that doesn't mean narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is in the absence, or basically narcolepsy occurs when you are getting enough main sleep time sleep. And in spite of that, you still have these episodes. A lot of people self-diagnose with narcolepsy when they do not have it, simply because they're not getting enough sleep or not getting restorative sleep during the night, and they're very tired during the day and have a tendency to drop off into naps. That's just your body and brain trying to pick up the sleep deficit. We won't hit it as much here, but there are cases of people who have insomnia, who they may fall asleep okay, but they keep waking up during the night and have trouble getting back to sleep, but they don't process any active memory while they're awake trying to get back to sleep. So they wake up in the morning with no memory that they were laying there for 2 hours trying to get to sleep. They don't know they have insomnia. So as that sleep deficit kind of tries to play back during the day and knocks them out while they're on the sofa doing something else, they may think, oh, I must have narcolepsy because of that. And you don't. So this brings us to breathing-related sleep disorders. We see 3 in here: obstructive sleep apnea, central sleep apnea, and sleep-related hypoventilation. There are similarities between them there. Sleep apnea is the one you've probably heard of the most. That is, while you're sleeping, you stop breathing temporarily. Whereas the second one there is simply reduction in breathing. So there's the difference there between I've stopped breathing altogether, or my breathing has slowed and I'm not getting the same airflow. So both of those fall into this category. Again, we need to find evidence that these have been going on. You see a list there of kind of other disturbances, other things going on, at least 5 experiences of apneas per hour of sleep with other disturbances. It says here snoring, snorting, gasping, daytime sleepiness, or if we don't find any of those other things, measuring 15 or more obstructive apneas per hour, regardless of others. A lot of people who have this, especially if you live alone or sleep alone, don't know that you have this. Quite often, and we're not into the dream section yet, but people who suffer this may often have dreams that they are suffocating or drowning, and that will startle them awake, and they'll gasp and start breathing again. They won't realize they stopped breathing. They think their gasping is because of the dream they were just having. So, again, a lot of people aren't aware they have it. And again, because this will wake you up a lot, and you may be startled, you may have an increase in physiological response that keeps you awake for a while after you've awakened from this. Some people may think they have insomnia rather than sleep apnea. Quite often it is a partner who witnesses you sleeping and witnesses this who is the first evidence of having this. So when it comes to central sleep apnea, let's take a look at a video here that will clear up. These are similar, but this video will tell us the differences between central and obstructive sleep apnea.
Obstructive sleep apnea is when the airway becomes narrowed or obstructed, and you're making the effort to breathe, but we do not see any flow in air movement coming from your nose or mouth. Whereas central sleep apnea occurs where your brain forgets to tell your body to breathe, if we're looking at it from a very simplistic term. And so we do not see the drive to breathe. So the first step is to come into the clinic and be seen by one of our physicians in the sleep medicine clinic. We'll go through a questionnaire and try to determine what risk factors we think you have for sleep apnea, such as obesity, snoring, daytime sleepiness. And then if we think that you have a high risk for meeting those criteria, then we would set you up for a sleep study, either in your home to do an overnight sleep study or in our laboratory, depending on your situation. The CPAP can be used to treat both conditions, and in some patients, that is enough. However, there are some patients that have more complex types of central sleep apnea that require more complicated types of machines to treat that condition. Obstructive sleep apnea actually has been linked to a lot of other problems, such as high blood pressure, and then, difficulty functioning during the day. If it goes untreated for a long period of time, there's an increased risk of early heart problems and those types of things.
Yeah, and then sleep-related hypoventilation. This can also be confused for either of the other conditions. This would require, again, a physical exam and blood tests on this. But this is when your breathing slows because you have elevated carbon dioxide levels or low levels of oxygen in the blood. So that can produce that. That would look like sleep apnea, except there is a different physiological root to what's causing it. And again, it requires medical study to narrow that one down. And this is where we just may have you sleep with an oxygen mask on. In any of these, you may do that. You may put on the little nose clips to increase airway function if you have problems with some of these. So all of these have treatments and methods of clinically identifying them, so they're not, impossible to cure there. This brings us to circadian rhythm, sleep-wake disorders, essentially your biological clock. And here's a key here that is going to kind of be a little bit of a template over all of these. If you take away people's access to the normal daylight cycle, we'll find your normal sleep-wake cycle is more than 24 hours. It may go 26 hours or 27, but we'll find you very quickly, if we just stick you in the dark, you go off your normal cycle and kind of lose what's going on there. That's why spring 2020, a lot of people staying home because of COVID-19 and not having a set daily schedule anymore, a lot of people started to find their sleep patterns kind of started to cycle around the clock. So we have 5 different ones in here. Let's take a look at these. Again, in general, we look at, when we say a circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorder, again, persistent or recurrent pattern of sleep disruption, and it's because your circadian system does not fit either your natural biological clock or the social clock. What does the social clock mean? That is kind of the cultural normal, cultural expectation of your day. Your social clock would be the time you need to get up in the morning to go to work or go to school or do something else. So if we look at a general social clock, we would say 8 in the morning or whatever would follow into something called breakfast time, and noon would be lunch, and then early evening would be dinner, and then you get between 8 and 11 or whatever, and that would be bedtime. That would be your social clock, and you kind of follow that. For most of us, our circadian system starts to fall in line with that. And again, although we may have a natural system that is 25 hours or 26 hours, as opposed to a 24-hour day, having to get up to that social clock time kind of resets it, trains it every day, to the point that a lot of you may find that you wake up just seconds before your alarm clock goes off in the morning because your brain gets trained into that cycle. So the key with this, again, because of the disruption of cycle in all of these, you are excessively sleepy during times when you would expect to be functional, may produce insomnia, may produce both. Okay. So when we say delayed sleep phase type, that is a delay in the timing of when you would usually go to sleep. So delay means, let's say I'm set on my social clock and I have a typical expectation that I go to bed at 9. And I start to go into this pattern that continues for weeks, where for some reason I cannot get to sleep until 11. So, and again, it says here, usually more than 2-hour delay. So I have trouble getting to sleep, which means I'm going to have trouble waking up at my normal time in the morning. And that's because the social clock is forcing me to wake up, yet I did not go to bed or go to sleep at the time I expected. Which is why on this last bullet here, it says when you are allowed to set your own sleep schedule, you show normal sleep quality. For some reason, your circadian clock, even though you want to go to bed at 9, says, nope, we're staying up till 11. But then you're still forced to get up at the same time, which obviously means you didn't get a full night's sleep. These things are most likely to be triggered around the times that we change time, when we fall back or spring ahead and disrupt the social clock. Because your circadian rhythm is set to a certain time, but then all of a sudden that social clock has jumped an hour one way or another. And then advanced sleep phase cycle. Okay, one was delayed. This is advanced. And here's where you're more than 2 hours earlier than what you would expect. So you get tired earlier. You also then wake up before you should and have trouble getting back to sleep. So you have early morning insomnia, again, because your cycle did not put you in the normal time frame. So again, let's say I still force myself to go to bed at 9, even though at 6 or 7, I'm feeling like I'm hitting the wall and my internal clock says you need to go to sleep. But because I'm staying on that social clock schedule, I force myself to stay up till 9. I force myself a little earlier, but my cycle will also end a little earlier, and I'll have trouble with that. Again, if people are allowed to set their own schedules, they'll go to sleep a little earlier, wake up a little earlier, they're fine. And this is one that usually is associated with getting older. The older you get, the more your phase will start to shift, and it's kind of an issue if you're trying to stay on a set schedule. Then the irregular sleep-wake time, we cannot find any pattern to your circadian rhythm, and you don't seem to have any major prolonged sleep period. So this is where you may take several extended naps during the day, but you cannot get yourself to stay asleep for an extended time. This also will cause sleepiness during your normal wake time. Then the non-24-hour sleep-wake cycle, this is just where your natural circadian rhythm is not following the day-night cycle outside. Again, we pointed out how your circadian rhythm is triggered by light hitting the eye, which means we are designed to shift this pattern over the seasons as there are longer days in the summer and shorter days in the winter. We're actually designed not to hibernate, but to spend more downtime and sleep time in the winter. Again, if this is triggered by the eye, but your eyes are damaged, you're functionally blind because of damage to the eye, it does not get this trigger. So this is more likely in people who have visual problems. And then the last one here, shift work type, that is where, as it says here, you are excessively sleepy at work, but you have problems sleeping at home. And that's usually when my natural biological clock does not fit my work schedule. So if I've been a day shift person and I now get a swing shift or night shift job, I am going to encounter this. Maybe the entire time I'm on that shift. But for a lot of people, when they regularly start doing different shift work, their clock will adjust over time to it, and that's what we would expect. So you probably would not develop a disorder. And this is why we put that 3-month period in there. If you're going to start working graveyard shift, within 3 months, we would expect that your clock has advanced and your circadian rhythm is now set to that new environment, and you're fine. If it hasn't within 3 months, you're still having trouble, now you're in the realm of disorder, and that's why we put the time frame on there. All right, and that brings us to parasomnias. And we will get to these in our second part.